Want to pop up this live image here over Jerusalem as we get to a developing story that we're following at this hour out of the Middle East. The Hamas terror group has now officially rejected Israel's proposal to extend the first phase of the ceasefire deal on the day that truce there is set to expire. While Egyptian officials have said that talks are underway in Cairo right now on phase 2 of the deal, a Hamas spokesperson tells reporters there are no current talks that are actually happening. The talks come as Israeli government spokesman David Mencer says nearly 60 hostages do remain in terrorist captivity in Gaza, the second phase of which will include the release of additional hostages. Israel, though, wants to extend the first phase rather than move on to the second phase, but it seems like Hamas is not on board right now, and of course, both sides would have to agree. All of this as the U.S. State Department is saying that it has plans to sell nearly $3 billion in weapons to Israel, including thousands of bombs and armored bulldozers. As always, so much to discuss here, so I do want to bring in a great friend of the show, Mark Chandler, Director of Government Relations and Professor of Practice at Coastal Carolina University, also a former senior defense intelligence official. Thank you so much for taking the time, as always, to be here with us.
You're welcome, Josh, and good morning.
Good morning. Well, first off, I do want to talk about the situation that is unfolding there. We learned a short time ago from the Hamas terror group. They say they have rejected Israel's proposal to extend the first phase of the ceasefire. Can you break down why exactly Israel would want to do that in the first place rather than move on to the second phase?
Well, if I could first start out with what the second phase is supposed to be, Josh, when we look at that, that's supposed to be a complete cessation of hostilities with the return of all the living hostages. You know, we still have around 60 plus hostages, 30. The numbers are fluctuate a little bit in the upper 30s for how many are still alive. However, it's the complete military withdrawal by the IDF that I think is concerning to Israel, because they have seen indications that Hamas might be getting ready to attack. And so if you do go into phase 2, that means Israel would be at a military disadvantage. So I think what they're trying to do, or at least what they propose in extending phase 1, is to get more hostages out. They would have exchanged 3 a week for the next 6 weeks, along with Palestinian prisoners, which would just be a basic continuation, as you talked about. However, if they do that and go into phase 2 and they don't have a military capability inside Gaza, that then leads to the advantage for Hamas. And I think Israel was really trying to make sure they were not at a military disadvantage over the coming weeks. It doesn't mean that the talks are over. It just, and the Israeli group unfortunately did fly back last night to Israel. So we'll see what develops over the next couple of days. But I think it was really a prudent offer for Israel to look to the future in case Hamas attacks.
And kind of digging a little bit deeper into something that you just talked about, there is Israeli intelligence, according to the Israel defense minister, that Hamas is not only regrouping and rebuilding itself, but also plotting attacks against Israeli military, other Israeli officials, and communities there in Israel. If that were to happen and Hamas was to carry out any sort of attack on Israel, does that instantly mean that the ceasefire is broken, is over?
Well, it would absolutely end the ceasefire completely. And I saw what the defense minister said. Prior to him saying that, however, I will say I was seeing indications and hearing from sources that Hamas has actually done a very good job of preparing to attack should the ceasefire end, or should they want to end it themselves. I mean, they have been regrouping, if you will. So they suffered some devastating losses, but not complete. It was Israel's objective to destroy Hamas, but there's still thousands of Hamas fighters. And if you look at the propaganda release of the hostages that they did throughout phase 1, you can see they have new weapons, new uniforms. They're well fed. So they have been using this last 6 weeks to regroup, resupply, and reposition their forces. They've worked on their command and control of their new units, getting new leaders in place. And there's a lot of what we call unexploded ordnance still there. They have been preparing IEDs to counter Israeli troops coming in. So Hamas has been actually doing very prudent military planning and preparation to kick off an attack against Israel should they decide now's the time, or should the talks break down. I think Hamas could immediately initiate operations.
Talking about the hostages, we mentioned that David Mencer, the Israeli government spokesperson, did say that there are nearly 60 hostages that are still in Hamas captivity there in Gaza. I believe the exact number he gave was 58, but there are questions at this point about how many of them are alive, how many are deceased. My question for you, we know that several of those hostages are Americans. So is that likely to get President Trump may be more involved in all of these negotiations, as of course he does want to free at least the Americans that are being held there?
Yeah, and Josh, it's important to note that those numbers do fluctuate among the total, the living and the dead right now. But what I count is 1 living American remains and 4 bodies that need to be returned who are Americans at least. And I do think that makes President Trump have some skin in this game. Remember, he put a lot of his personal stake into this to get this ceasefire kicked off as his administration was coming into office. And so we'll see how this plays out. But the push for Israel to stay in phase 1, the denial by Hamas, obviously shows you that there's tension in the negotiations to get into phase 2. Supposedly, Steve Witkoff was going to travel to the Middle East this weekend, but after events in the White House yesterday, I'm not sure if he's going to go there or have to deal with something in Europe. So we'll have to see how this plays out. But if you see Witkoff go to the Middle East, that does mean that President Trump is putting a stronger stake in this, getting that personal stake to get those hostages released and either figure out some compromise between a phase 1 alpha, let's say, and a phase 2 transition, or get into phase 2 to try to get them back. But you could see a push. I do believe President Trump can handle both the Ukraine situation and the Middle East situation with his staff. I would follow Witkoff's travels to kind of see where he's going to put his priority this week.
And Mark, you kind of hinted at this, but we did see that very heated exchange, and that might be an understatement, between President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday in the Oval Office. We also know that just several weeks ago, we saw Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, visit the White House as well, meeting with President Trump. How do the two differ? Because both are involved in wars right now, and it appears that the meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu went a lot better than what we saw with Volodymyr Zelensky.
Yeah, Josh, I could actually spend hours, your entire show, talking about that, what happened yesterday, how that just, it seemed to be like an airline pilot, his plane running in, and nobody wanted to pull up before the crash. I mean, it was quite a spectacle, and I don't think anybody could contain it. And that does show the difference between the Trump-Zelensky relationship, as you're talking about, and the Netanyahu-Trump relationship. I think with Netanyahu and Trump, you have 2 strong leaders, 2 forceful leaders, both with clear objectives of what they want. I'm not saying Zelensky doesn't have those, but when you look at it, I think there's a mutual respect between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, they do not agree on everything. I've got to point that out, and how they're going to move forward, or maybe the steps to occur. Yesterday's phase 1 extension versus going to phase 2 being an example. I don't think you're going to see them come to verbal blows, especially in the White House, over something like this. They have disagreed, especially when Netanyahu was at the White House a few weeks ago, but they did that in private. And if they're going to make public statements, I think there's that diplomatic respect, if you will, that they're going to provide one another just out of that mutual respect of that relationship. So you're going to see that continue out there. And unfortunately, we'll see how this falls out for the Ukraine. But I think you're going to see a strong backing by Trump for Netanyahu and anything he's got. We have 2 common enemies, 3 actually, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. And I think that's going to be a bonding factor for Trump and Netanyahu going forward.
I want to ask you about a report that is coming in now from the Times of Israel. They're saying that Beirut airport authorities actually seized about $2.5 million in cash that was bound for the Hezbollah terror group on a man who was arriving there at the airport from Turkey. Talking about that fragile ceasefire that does remain in effect, is this an example of Lebanon maybe trying to fight back against Hezbollah, or is it possibly just kind of a one-time situation that did play out there?
Well, I think this incident points out a couple of things, but let me address your first question specifically. This is not a one-off for Lebanon. Now, when I say it's not a one-off for Lebanon, it's not a one-off for the Lebanese government that we've seen come to power and establish itself in the last few months, especially since Iran's influence has been diminished and Hezbollah has really been decapitated in there and its influence has diminished. So you've seen this new Lebanese government try to take control and minimize the Hezbollah influence. This isn't the first time that they've intercepted some resupply flights or money flights coming in that originated actually in Iran. So this Lebanese government has worked a little bit with Israel, taking intelligence tip-offs from Israel to try to intercept flights like this. And they've allowed Israel to conduct some strikes along the Lebanese-Syrian border where Iran is still trying to resupply Hezbollah. So I think this Lebanese administration is trying to establish a strong footing and keep Hezbollah in its place. The second part of this that I want to talk about is where you mentioned that this flight originated from. It came from Turkey. And I think what the viewers need to understand that this shows that the Iranian network is still widely involved across pulling the strings behind in several things happening in the Middle East. And it shows Turkey's collusion with that. Turkey has a antagonistic relationship with Israel, and that's seen it play out in Syria, but also with Hamas. So you look at this, Turkey has been helping support and finance Hamas and Hezbollah and working with Iran to counter anything that Israel might do. So you see kind of the broader play taking place here across the Middle East.
All right. Mark Chandler, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Anything else you want to add about the situation playing out there in the Middle East? There are so many developments happening pretty much on an hourly basis. Obviously, a lot to discuss there. So anything else you want to add?
Josh, I think the next couple of days are going to be critical as we move forward to really see what we can do between a phase one and a phase two there. And as I said, maybe there's a compromise, but Hamas came back pretty steadfast and saying they're not going to negotiate an additional phase one. And I think you need to see that that is backed by some confidence that they have that they're prepared to attack and move forward if they need to do so.
All right. Mark Chandler, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and help break it down. We appreciate it.
Josh, you're welcome as always. Thanks and have a great day.
Of course.